The air in this steel coffin tastes like raw copper and diesel fuel, thick and abrasive against the back of my throat. With every panicked breath I try to steal. My fingers are locked around a brass flashlight. Its weak, flickering beam is the only thing slicing through the absolute, suffocating dark, illuminating nothing but the terror in my own reflection against the slick, riveted bulkheads. Sweat stings my eyes, mixing with the black mazout coating the hold. The water is rising. I can hear it sloshing against the steel plates, cold and indifferent, swirling with the oily blood of the USS Oklahoma. It laps at my shins, an icy grip pulling me deeper into the reality of our situation. I am Jack Miller, 20 years old. A year ago, I was pouring molten slag in a Pittsburgh foundry, choking on coal dust and dreaming of the vast, open ocean. Now, I am breathing shallow, trapped in the inverted bowels of a battleship that has suddenly become a tomb. The terror presses down on my chest, harder than the thousands of tons of steel above us. We are in the dark. We are upside down, and the ocean is methodically breaking its way inside, claiming this steel cavern, inch by agonizing inch. It feels like a lifetime has passed in this lightless purgatory. But the nightmare began only 12 minutes ago. Sunday morning, December 7th. The sky over Pearl Harbor had been a brilliant, piercing blue, the kind of clear, endless horizon that made a man forget about the wars tearing up the rest of the world. The Oklahoma rested at Battleship Row, massive and silent, a sleeping giant moored in the warm, tranquil Hawaiian waters. The mood below decks had been lazy, thick with the anticipation of liberty, Sunday services, and a hot breakfast. The smell of strong coffee and fried bacon had drifted through the ventilation shafts, mixing with the ever-present scent of brass polish, floor wax, and damp canvas. I had just finished my watch and was making my way through the third deck. The familiar, comforting hum of the ship's generators vibrated through the soles of my boots, a mechanical heartbeat that told us all was well. I was used to heat, used to the relentless, skin-blistering inferno of the steel mills back in Pennsylvania, where men worked until they dropped. But the heat of the ship was different. It was an enclosed warmth, a closeness that bred a unique kind of brotherhood among the crew. I pushed through the heavy steel hatch into our berthing compartment and found Art Kelly sitting on his rack. Art was adjusting his round, wire-rimmed spectacles with a trembling hand. Art was a farm boy from Iowa, barely 19 years old, with dirt blonde hair and a face that still carried the innocence of the cornfields. He always looked like he was expecting the sky to fall, or in this case, the deck to cave in. His hands shook, not from cowardice, but from a constant, nervous energy that he could never quite burn off. Right then, he was trying to read a letter from home, the thin paper wrinkled and stained with black grease from his duties down in the engine room. She says, "The winter is coming early this year," Art muttered, his voice cracking slightly as he adjusted his glasses again. "Says the frost is already killing the late crops." I don't know, Jack. Sometimes I wonder what the hell I'm doing out here in the middle of the ocean when I should be fixing the tractor. You're out here because the Navy pays you 3 squares a day and you don't have to shovel manure, I replied, forcing a grin, trying to ease the tension that always seemed to coil around his shoulders. Relax, Artie. It's Sunday. Not a damn thing is going to happen today except inspection and maybe a baseball game. Next to him stood Donald McIntyre, the old salt of our section. McIntyre was a man carved from solid oak and soaked in brine, his face lined with the deep, leathery maps of a dozen deployments. He was meticulously checking his brass pocket watch, snapping the engraved cover shut with a sharp, authoritative click that echoed over the low murmur of the compartment. He was always checking that watch, obsessed with the precise measurement of naval time. He didn't just follow the schedule, he embodied it. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his boots polished to a mirror shine that reflected the weak overhead lights. 5 minutes to morning colors, boys, McIntyre muttered, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that demanded respect. He slipped the watch into his pocket and glared at us, his eyes hard and uncompromising. Get your gear stowed and look sharp. The Navy doesn't pay you to sit around like a bunch of bums. And Kelly, stop shaking before you vibrate right off that bunk. I was just unlacing my boots, feeling the relief of taking weight off my tired feet, when the world ended. It was exactly 07:55 a.m. There was no warning, no klaxon, no frantic shout from the watchman on the deck above. Just a sudden, concussive shock that hit the ship like a runaway freight train crashing into a brick wall. The impact was entirely unnatural. It stole the air straight from our lungs and threw us all violently to the deck. The steel plates beneath us buckled and groaned, emitting a sickening, high-pitched screech of metal tearing and screaming in agony. For a fraction of a second, nobody moved. The sheer magnitude of the impact froze us in place. Dust and paint chips rained down from the overhead, coating our hair and uniforms in a fine, gray powder. What in God's name was that? Art gasped, scrambling to his knees, his glasses hanging askew on his face. Boiler explosion? No, McIntyre barked, his veteran instincts kicking in instantly. He was already on his feet, his eyes wide but focused. That was external, torpedo. Before we could even process the reality of his words, a second torpedo struck the port side, followed almost instantly by a third. The explosions were deafening, bone-shaking detonations that shattered the peaceful Sunday morning with a violence that completely defied human comprehension. The lights flickered, dimmed to a sickly yellow, and died, plunging us into a terrifying temporary darkness. A heartbeat later, the emergency red battle lanterns kicked on, casting a hellish, crimson glow over the compartment. The shadows danced wildly against the bulkheads, making the room look like the inner circles of a slaughterhouse. Then, the general quarters alarm began to wail. It was a mechanical screaming that cut through the ringing in my ears, adding a layer of structured panic to the chaos. Bong, bong, bong. The sound reverberated through the steel, demanding action. The sharp, acrid smell of burning cordite and ruptured fuel lines began to flood the ventilation system, choking us. Torpedoes! We're taking hits! Port side! McIntyre roared, hauling Art to his feet by the collar of his uniform shirt. Move your asses! Get to your battle stations. Go, go, go. We scrambled for the hatch, but the Oklahoma was already dying. The massive battleship, a beast displacing nearly 30,000 tons of water, began to list with an unnatural speed. Within seconds, the flat deck we had been standing on tilted to 10 degrees, then 20. The physics of our everyday reality began to warp and fail. The heavy steel lockers, supposedly secured, tore loose from their moorings and crashed across the compartment. Tools, sea bags, mess trays, and loose gear became deadly projectiles, raining down across the slanting space. A heavy wrench flew past my head, missing my skull by an inch, and smashed into the bulkhead with a clang. Men screamed. They scrambled, clawing desperately at the bulkheads, trying to find purchase on a floor that was rapidly becoming a slick, impassable wall. "Hold on to something!" I yelled, grabbing a thick steel stanchion. My foundry-hardened hands gripped the cold, painted iron with a desperate strength. My knuckles turned white as I hung on, watching the nightmare unfold around me. The angle worsened rapidly to 30, then 45 degrees. The terrible, tearing sound of rushing water echoed through the passageways, a violent torrent tearing through the breached hull and flooding the compartments below us. I could hear the muffled screams of men trapped in the lower engine rooms, a chorus of terror and desperation that is burned into my mind forever. I looked at Art. He was clutching a pipe, his face drained of all color, his eyes wide behind his crooked glasses. He looked like a terrified child. McIntyre was barking orders, trying to maintain discipline in the face of the apocalypse, but the roar of the ocean, tearing through steel, drowned out his commands. The ship was rolling. It wasn't just sinking to the bottom, it was completely capsizing. Then came the true horror. Between the 5th and 10th minute of the attack, the mighty USS Oklahoma rolled past the point of no return. We were caught in the belly of the beast as it died. The deck tilted to 90 degrees. For a surreal moment, we were standing on the bulkheads, the walls becoming our floor, the doors above us like trapdoors to the sky. But the momentum didn't stop. The weight of the ship, the devastating holes in her side, and the influx of thousands of tons of water pulled her further. 120 degrees, 150. Gravity completely inverted. The world turned upside down. Everything crashed to the overhead. I lost my grip on the stanchion and fell. I was thrown through the air, crashing into a tangle of heavy pipes and unyielding brass valves. My shoulder slammed into cold iron with bone-jarring force. Pain radiated down my arm, sharp and blinding, but the pure, unadulterated adrenaline pumping through my veins masked the worst of it. I scrambled in the dark, my hands sliding through thick oil and cold water. The red emergency lights flickered one last time and shorted out with a shower of sparks, plunging us into the darkness that I am sitting in right now. It took only 12 minutes, just 12 minutes for a heavily armored battleship to roll 180 degrees and settle in the soft, thick mud of Pearl Harbor. It had become a capsized tomb for hundreds of my brothers, a steel coffin buried in the water. Now, I am here, in the dark, shivering uncontrollably, clutching this heavy brass flashlight like it's a lifeline. The black water is rising steadily, climbing my legs, soaking my uniform in freezing, oily sludge. McIntyre is silent, and I pray to God he was just knocked unconscious during the roll. I didn't know it then, but this rising, freezing water was only a fraction of the nightmare that awaited us. We thought the initial attack, the torpedoes, and the capsizing were the worst of it, but the real terror was what was waiting for us in the flooded, inverted maze of the ship. We were trapped in a steel lung that was slowly, inevitably, exhaling its last breath, and the threat of drowning in this hold was just the first shadow in a much longer, darker tunnel of survival. Every groan of the hull above me sounds like the ship tearing itself apart. The air is getting heavier by the second. We are buried alive, upside down in the belly of a dead giant, and the ocean is not going to stop until it claims every last one of us. The world did not end in fire. The great ship, our Oklahoma, had turned her belly to the sky, dragging us down into the mud of Pearl Harbor. Gravity itself had betrayed us. The deck was now the ceiling, and the bulkheads slanted at wrong angles. We were trapped in the bowels of the ship, deep in the lower compartments, sealed inside a steel drum that was slowly filling with the Pacific Ocean. My boots slipped against the inverted steel plating, trying to find purchase on a surface that was never meant to be walked upon. Every surface was slick, coated in a thick, viscous layer of heavy fuel oil that had ruptured from the main tanks. It clung to our skin, our hair, burning our eyes and making every breath a chore. The water was at my chest. We were 6 men, huddled in this small section of the corridor outside the B4 compartment, our shoulders pressed together, shivering uncontrollably. I held the brass flashlight in my right hand, elevating it above the waterline. It was the only source of illumination left in our drowned world. The light danced over the terrified faces of the men. Mac, holding onto a sheared pipe. Young Tommy, his eyes wide and unblinking, shivering violently. And the others, their features smeared with black grease. The shadows thrown by the flashlight were long and distorted, making the twisted wreckage of the compartment look like the ribs of some colossal, dead leviathan. Then, the inevitable happened. The beam flickered. It was a subtle stutter at first, a slight dimming of the yellow light. I tapped the heavy brass casing against my palm, hoping to jolt the connection back to life. The bulb glowed a dull, dying orange, the filament struggling against the dying batteries. "Don't let it go out, Jack," Tommy whispered, his voice trembling, echoing off the steel bulkheads. "Please, don't let it go out." I twisted the cap, my slick fingers struggling to grip the knurled brass. "Hold on, Tommy. I got it. It's just a loose connection," I lied. We were going to be plunged into the abyss. I shook it harder. The orange glow narrowed to a pinprick, a final, dying ember, and then nothing. And the absence of light was total. I could not see my own hand an inch from my face. The panic was immediate, a visceral terror that seized my chest. I felt the walls closing in. My heart hammered against my ribs. I forced myself to breathe slow, shallow breaths, fighting the urge to thrash, to scream. "Stay exactly where you are. I can't see. I can't breathe," one of the men cried out. "Steady, steady, goddammit." Mac's voice cut through the panic, firm and grounding. I felt his hand brush against my shoulder, a sudden point of contact in the void. We conserve our energy. A heavy, rushing roar. Water. Fast-moving water. It was coming from the B4 compartment, just down the slanted corridor. "Jack! Jack! The hatch is giving way! The water is coming in too fast!" It was Miller and Davies. They had been trying to secure the valves when the ship rolled. The bulkhead between us and them was groaning under the immense pressure of the ocean outside. The watertight door, connecting our section to theirs, was partially open, and I could hear the torrent of water forcing its way through the gap, spraying into our compartment. If that door wasn't sealed, if the water from B4 flooded our section, the entire pocket of air we were clinging to would be destroyed. We would all drown in a matter of minutes. The math was brutal. 6 men out here, 2 men in there. The rushing sound grew louder. I found the heavy steel wheel of the hatch. "We have to pull it shut," I yelled over the roar. Art grabbed my shoulder in the dark. "Jack, we can't leave them," he cried, his voice breaking. We strained against it, our boots slipping, our muscles screaming. The pressure of the water fought us, pushing the heavy door back. From the other side, through the gap, I heard Davies scream, "Help us! Please, Jack! Pull us through!" My stomach twisted into a knot. The gap was too small, the pressure too great. If we opened it wider to let them through, the flood would overwhelm us instantly. We had to close it. We had to seal them in. God forgive me. "Pull!" Mac roared. We threw our entire weight into the wheel, pulling against the force of the ocean. The heavy steel door ground on its hinges, inches at a time. The screams from the other side grew more frantic as they realized what we were doing. "No! Don't shut it! Don't leave us!" The words hammered into my soul, driving spikes of guilt deep into my chest. With a final heave, the door slammed shut. The roaring of the water was instantly muffled, cut off by the thick steel. I grabbed the locking dogs, throwing the heavy metal levers into place, sealing the hatch tight. Clank, 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 6 levers. 6 nails in a coffin. The roaring stopped. For a few seconds, silence. We had bought ourselves time. From the other side, through inches of solid steel, we could hear them. They were pounding on the bulkhead with their bare hands, rhythmic thuds that vibrated through the metal into my own flesh. We heard their muffled cries, their pleas for a salvation that would never come. We listened as their pounding grew weaker, less frequent. We listened until the pounding stopped entirely. The silence returned, heavy and crushing. The guilt was heavier than the water, heavier than the steel. I had condemned 2 men to death. I had sealed their tomb. Time lost all meaning. Minutes stretched into hours, or perhaps hours compressed into minutes. The air was growing stale, heavy with carbon dioxide. Every breath required a conscious effort. "We have to think." Mac's voice finally broke the silence, raspy and dry. "We have to conserve what we have." "What do we have?" Tommy asked, his voice barely a whisper. "We have nothing. We have air. We have space. We have each other," Mac replied. "And we have to rationalize. Nobody talks unless necessary. Every word uses air. Every movement uses energy. We stand still. We breathe slow." The thirst was beginning to set in. The salt stung my cracked lips. "Water," one of the other men muttered. "I need water." "There is no fresh water," I said, the harsh truth cutting through the dark. "But do not drink what we are standing in. It will kill you faster than the thirst. We have to endure. They don't know we're here. We're at the bottom of the harbor. We're ghosts. They will come," I insisted, though my own faith was wearing thin. "They will cut through the hull." Mac shifted in the water. I heard the clink of heavy metal against steel. "If they are going to cut through, they need to know exactly where we are." Mac's hand closed around something solid in the dark, heavy brass, a damage control wrench. We had a voice now. "I'm going to start tapping," Mac said. 3 strikes. A pause. 3 strikes. SOS. The sharp, metallic clang of the brass wrench striking the steel bulkhead shattered the silence. Clang, clang, clang. The sound was in the confined space, ringing in our ears, vibrating through the water. Pause. Clang, clang, clang. Mac established the rhythm. It became our heartbeat, our only connection to the world above the waterline. We took turns holding the heavy wrench, striking the steel until our arms burned and our hands bled. It was exhausting work, draining our precious energy, but it gave us purpose. It was a task, a mission. It kept the despair at bay. Between the shifts of tapping, when the silence crept back in, the vulnerability of the men began to show. The stoic military discipline fractured, revealing the raw, frightened humans underneath. "My wife, Sarah," Tommy spoke softly into the void. "We got married 2 months ago. She's in California, waiting for me." The words hung in the stale air. No one offered false comfort. We just listened. "She makes this cherry pie," Tommy continued, his voice cracking. "I can almost smell it right now. I just want to sit at my kitchen table and eat a slice of cherry pie." The darkness remained. The USS Oklahoma was our tomb, and we were just waiting for the earth to cover us. We had been trapped in the belly of the capsized battleship for what felt like several lifetimes. Time had lost all meaning down there. There were no watches left ticking, no sunlight to track the hours, only the agonizingly slow rhythm of our own shallow breathing and the intermittent groans of the stressed steel bulkheads settling deeper into the mud of Pearl Harbor. The air was growing foul. Every breath required a conscious effort. It felt like trying to pull thick sludge through a damp wool blanket. My lungs burned with a dull, persistent ache, a constant reminder that the oxygen we were consuming was not being replaced. The water in the compartment was chest-high, slick with a thick layer of fuel oil that coated everything. It was a cold embrace that seeped into our bones, stealing our body heat degree by degree. We were clinging to overturned pipes and machinery, anything that would keep our heads in the shrinking pocket of compressed air, trapped against what used to be the floor of the compartment. My fingers were pruned and numb, devoid of feeling, yet they clamped onto a twisted valve wheel with the strength of a dying man. Next to me, Art Kelly was trembling uncontrollably, his teeth chattering so loud it echoed. He was whispering to himself, something about the frost killing the late crops in Iowa. I could hear his rapid, shallow breaths, the sound of a boy trying to find enough air in a space that had none left to give. "Miller," a voice whispered from the pitch black. It was Chief Reynolds. His voice was a rasping scrape, stripped of all its usual authority, reduced to the raw essence of survival. "How much space?" "Between the water and the steel, about 2 feet, Chief," I rasped back, the words tearing at my dry throat. "Maybe less. It feels like the water is creeping up." "It is," he replied. "The pressure is keeping it at bay. We are breathing our own safety net. Every lungful we take, the water claims another fraction of an inch." That was the brutal reality of our situation. We were trapped in a cruel paradox. The very air we needed to survive was the only thing keeping the Pacific Ocean from rushing in and drowning us. The silence returned, heavier and more menacing than before. We were a dozen men in that space, but the isolation was complete. You could not see the man an arm's length away. You could only hear him dying. The lack of oxygen was beginning to take its toll, twisting my thoughts, making it hard to hold on to the present reality. Memories of home, of a warm kitchen in Ohio, of the smell of fresh coffee, intruded with a sharp, painful clarity. Then, something changed. It started as a vibration, a faint, rhythmic shudder that I felt through the palms of my hands, clamped to the valve wheel, before I actually heard it. It was a subtle disturbance in the water, a ripple that broke the stagnant surface. I held my breath, straining my ears, terrified that the ship was finally breaking apart, that the twisted metal was giving way and the ocean was coming to finish the job. But it was not the sound of breaking steel. It was a solid, deliberate impact, a heavy strike against the outer hull. The sound carried through the water and the metal, distorted but unmistakable. Someone was walking on the bottom of the ship, up above us, out in the open air. The realization hit me. We were not forgotten. They were looking for us. A collective gasp echoed in the small air pocket. "Did you hear that?" Art cried out, his voice cracking with a sudden, fragile hope. "They are up there. They found us. Keep quiet, kid," Chief Reynolds ordered, his voice suddenly sharp, regaining a fraction of its former command. "Do not waste your air yelling. Let them do the work. We just have to hold on." The impacts grew louder, more distinct. They were rhythmic, methodical, not just footsteps, but the heavy, deliberate strikes of a sledgehammer against the steel plating. Every blow sent a shockwave through the water, a concussive force that vibrated in my teeth and rattled my bones. In the confined space of our metal tomb, the sound was magnified, echoing and rebounding off the bulkheads until it became a torment. It was a roar that threatened to split my skull, but it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my life. It was the sound of salvation. Then came a new noise, a high-pitched, grinding screech that tore through the air and set my teeth on edge. It was the sound of heavy machinery. They had brought pneumatic drills. They were trying to cut through the hull. The noise escalated into a maddening scream. The metal above our heads screamed, as the drill bit chewed into the hardened armor plate. It felt as if they were drilling directly into my skull. The pain in my ears was excruciating, a piercing agony that made me want to scream, but I clamped my jaw shut, refusing to let the filthy water into my mouth. We waited in a state of suspended animation, enduring the auditory assault, our entire existence focused on that single point of contact above us. Minutes stretched into hours. The drill would scream, then stop. We could hear the faint, muffled shouts of the rescue crews through the steel. Then the sledgehammers would start again, followed by another round of drilling. They were working blindly, trying to find a section of the hull thin enough to pierce without hitting a critical structural beam. Suddenly, the quality of the sound changed. The high-pitched scream of the drill bit suddenly dropped in pitch, a sudden shift in resistance. A sharp crack echoed through the compartment, followed immediately by a hiss. The drill had pierced the hull. They had broken through. For a brief, shining second, a cheer erupted from our cracked lips. My shoulders dropped. The muscles in my jaw unclenched for the first time in hours. Then, the true horror of our situation became apparent. The air we had been breathing, the foul, depleted oxygen that had kept us alive, was compressed. It was holding back the ocean. And now, they had just drilled a vent hole directly to the outside atmosphere. The compressed air in our small pocket violently rushed out through the tiny drill hole, escaping with a roar that drowned out the sound of the machinery above. The pressure dropped instantly, a sudden equalization that popped my ears with force. And as the air rushed out, the water rushed in to take its place. The delicate balance was destroyed. The water level, which had been creeping up by fractions of an inch over hours, suddenly surged upward with speed. It was not a slow rise. It was an angry surge. The water. Art screamed, his voice bubbling as the surface reached his mouth. Men were thrashing, kicking, fighting for purchase against the slick bulkheads, trying to climb higher, but there was nowhere left to go. The ceiling was right there. We were pinned against the steel. The water hit my chin. The air pocket, which had been 2 feet deep just moments ago, was collapsing rapidly. The hiss of the escaping air was a roar of our safety net bleeding away. The water was at my lower lip. I was kicking frantically, trying to tread water, but my heavy boots and waterlogged uniform were dragging me down. I clung to the valve wheel, pulling myself up with the last reserves of my strength, shoving my face into the rapidly shrinking gap between the water and the steel. We had maybe 2 inches of air left, 2 inches between life and the abyss. A splash, a thrashing, and then silence. The water had claimed the first of us. I was hyperventilating, taking rapid, shallow gasps of the foul air, my nose pressed flat against the metal. The water was sloshing over my face, filling my ears, blinding me. The men outside had no idea. They had no way of knowing that their attempt to save us was actually executing us. They had released the pressure that was keeping us alive. Then, through the cacophony of the escaping air and the thrashing water, a new sensation arrived. It was not a sound, but a feeling: heat. A sudden, intense point of heat bloomed against the steel, right above my face. It was localized, sharp, and it grew hotter by the second. The water around my face began to steam. I realized what was happening. They had realized the drill was not enough, or perhaps they were just following protocol. They were using a cutting torch. They were going to burn through the hull. The heat became unbearable. The steel plate above my nose was turning into a frying pan. I had to pull my face away, but pulling away meant dipping my mouth into the rising water. I turned my head to the side, pressing my cheek against a cooler section of the metal, gasping for the tiny sliver of air that remained. The tip of the cutting torch had melted through the outer layer of the armor plate and was biting into the inner steel. The glow grew brighter, illuminating the nightmare around me for the first time in countless hours. The red light cast long, shifting shadows, revealing the faces of the remaining men, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths pressed against the ceiling, fighting for every breath. The torch began to move, dragging a line of molten steel across the ceiling. Some of them landed on my face, burning my skin, but I could not let go. I could not flinch. I had to keep my mouth in that 2-inch gap. The hissing of the escaping air was now joined by the roar of the cutting torch and the splashing of dying men. The red line of molten metal was slowly carving a rectangle above us. Each inch felt like an eternity. Then the grinding reached a pitch that shook my teeth loose in their sockets, and the steel plate gave way. When the steel finally gave way, it was not a gentle opening, but a tearing, a rectangular jagged wound in the armored belly of the ship. A sliver of blinding, impossible light pierced the gloom. After endless hours of pitch blackness, that thin beam of tropical sunlight was an aggressive assault on my eyes. Burning retinas adjusted to the dark. The rush of fresh air that followed the breach was agonizingly sharp, sweeping away the stench of cordite, blood, and fear that had become our entire world. Hands reached through the ragged hole. Strong hands grabbing collars, belts, arms, hauling us upward against the pull of gravity and the suction of the flooded space. My turn came. The jagged edges of the cut steel tore at my uniform, scoring red lines into my forearms as I was dragged through the narrow opening. The transition was instant. One moment, I was submerged in the freezing, oily hell of the capsized hull, waiting to drown. The next, I was violently thrust onto the upturned bottom of the ship. The sheer intensity of the Hawaiian morning sun was paralyzing. I threw my arms over my face, the sudden glare pressing down on me. The air, though no longer confined, was thick and heavy, saturated with the acrid stench of burning fuel and charred metal. My eyes watered uncontrollably as they slowly began to adjust to the light. The silence I had expected upon salvation was completely absent. Instead, an apocalyptic roar assaulted my ears. Sirens wailed continuously, a chorus that offered no comfort, only a stark confirmation of disaster. The rescue workers swarmed around the breach, their faces smeared with soot and sweat, their expressions a mix of grim determination and underlying horror. They shouted commands, their voices barely audible over the din. I felt hands on my shoulders, guiding me, pushing me away from the opening to make room for the next man to be pulled from the depths. I stumbled forward, my legs trembling, muscles cramping from hours of treading water and clinging to the steel bulkheads. Every step was a monumental effort, my body sluggish, resisting the command to move. I slipped to my knees, the abrasive non-skid surface tearing at my skin, but I hardly felt it. The shock had settled deep into my core, numbing the physical pain and leaving only a hollow, echoing void. I crawled for a few feet before forcing myself upright again, my gaze finally lifting from the steel beneath my boots to the world around me. The first breath of untainted air hit my lungs like a fist. It was sharp, sweet, and overwhelmingly clean compared to the vile stew of oil and depleted oxygen we had been surviving on. I coughed violently, my chest heaving as it finally drew in the life it had been denied for so long. The tropical sun bore down on my exhausted eyes, forcing me to squint against the glare. When my vision finally cleared, the sight that met my watering eyes was a vision of ruin. The majestic Battleship Row, the pride of the fleet, was a scene of utter devastation. Enormous warships, titans of steel, were listing heavily, their superstructures shattered, their guns silenced, and pointing uselessly toward the sky. Black, oily smoke choked the horizon, turning the brilliant blue Hawaiian morning into a nightmare of twilight and fire. Flames leaped hundreds of feet into the air, painting the thick smoke with a demonic orange glow. The water itself was burning, thick slicks of fuel igniting on the surface, trapping men who had abandoned ship. I could see bodies floating amidst the wreckage, a horrifying testament to the morning's slaughter. The rescue workers around us moved in a state of chaotic frenzy, shouting over the roar of the inferno, their faces masks of soot, sweat, and sheer disbelief. I looked over my shoulder, back at the overturned hull of the USS Oklahoma. It lay like a slaughtered leviathan in the mud, her propellers frozen against the sky, barnacles and red anti-fouling paint exposed to the sun for the first time. Small boats circled her hull, rescuers tapping with hammers, listening for answers that might never come. I saw Art Kelly being hauled up next to me, his glasses gone, his face streaked with tears and oil, but breathing. He was alive. We were alive. But as the secondary explosions from the Arizona sent shockwaves rattling through my teeth, I knew a part of us would forever remain trapped in that dark, inverted steel tomb. If you feel these forgotten records and the courage of the men who walked through that mud deserve to be remembered, leave a sign of respect by subscribing to the channel. Share your thoughts or your own family's history in the comments below. It helps ensure their sacrifices are never lost to time.